Her name was Miriam Calloway. She was 34 years old on the evening that everything her parents had built came to rest quietly in her hands. That was 3 years ago. Her mother had stood in the driveway of a house she believed she owned and had told Miriam, with the same calm she reserved for ordering at restaurants, that Miriam had never been the kind of daughter worth sacrificing for. The porch light caught the white of her mother's linen blouse. A check sat on the kitchen counter behind them, a check that changed the meaning of every word spoken in that family for the previous 22 years. They did not know about the deed. They had never thought to ask. Before Miriam tells you what she did with it, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if stories about quiet endurance and honest reckoning are the kind you come back to. Drop your city and the time where you are in the comments below. Miriam always reads them. If you are the kind of person who has ever watched someone in your family receive something that was yours, a gift, an opportunity, a piece of trust, and chosen to say nothing rather than cause a scene, then this story was built for you. Miriam was that person for a long time. She believed, the way quiet people often do, that patience was enough. It was not. But what replaced it was something far more durable. The Calloway family lived in a pale yellow colonial on West Haven Drive in a mid-sized town in eastern Ohio, the kind of town where the high school football stadium had better lighting than the public library, and where a family's standing was measured by which pew they occupied at First Methodist. The house had 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, and a maple tree in the backyard that Miriam's grandfather had planted the year her mother was born. Gerald Calloway managed residential loans at Carver County Savings and Loan for 31 years. He wore the same style of navy blazer to work every day, drove a car that was precisely 2 model years behind current, and prided himself on never making a scene in public. His defining quality was not cruelty. It was a kind of careful availability. He was present enough to provide plausible deniability but absent enough to never actually intervene. When the house grew tense, Gerald found reasons to be in the garage. Diane Calloway ran the household the way a project manager runs a difficult client account, with meticulous attention to optics and a private ledger of grievances that never closed. She chaired the church's annual auction committee for 11 consecutive years. She kept a guest book for dinner parties. She remembered every slight ever offered to her by a neighbor, a sister-in-law, or a grocery store clerk, and she filed them with the patience of someone who believed, fundamentally, that accounts were always eventually settled. Miriam had an older sister named Celeste, who was 3 years her senior, and had arrived in the family as the kind of child that parents sometimes describe, without meaning to reveal anything, as the easy one. Celeste had her mother's instinct for social performance and her father's talent for staying out of difficult conversations. She had bright, careful eyes and a laugh that she produced at exactly the right moments. She was not a bad person. She was simply the one the family had organized itself around, and she had accepted that arrangement without question, because accepting it required nothing from her. The difference between how the 2 girls were treated was not announced. It arrived in details. At Celeste's 16th birthday, Diane rented the back room of a restaurant that the family could not comfortably afford and invited 42 people. The tablecloths were ivory. There was a custom cake. Miriam turned 16 18 months later at a dinner that Diane described, with cheerful practicality, as intimate. There were 6 people. The cake came from the grocery store bakery in a white cardboard box, and one of the roses on top was slightly smeared where someone had pressed the lid closed too hard. Miriam ate around the smear. She did not mention it. Celeste went to homecoming with a boy named Preston, whose family the Calloways respected. Miriam's date to her own homecoming was a boy named Arlo, whose family owned a tire shop on Route 9, and Diane had spent the week before the dance finding small opportunities to mention that Arlo seemed like a nice enough young man. The phrasing "nice enough" was one Miriam filed away. There was one person in that household who treated both girls the same, and that was Miriam's maternal grandfather, a retired civil engineer named Howard Breen. Howard had built bridges in 3 states before his knees gave out, and he had brought to grandfathering the same methodical attention he had once brought to load calculations and stress tolerances. He visited on the second Sunday of every month, brought a bag of those orange circus peanut candies that nobody but him seemed to enjoy, and always sat beside Miriam at the table. He did not make a ceremony of it. He simply chose the seat beside her, and over 20 years of second Sundays, that choice accumulated into something that Miriam understood, without being able to name it, as a statement. Howard saw the way things worked in the Calloway house. He was an engineer. He observed load distributions. He understood, without ever saying so directly, that Miriam was carrying more than her share of the family's structural weight, and that no one had thought to acknowledge this because the structure was holding. When Miriam was 19, the summer before her junior year of college, Howard called her on a Tuesday evening and asked if she could come by his apartment the following Saturday. He had something he wanted to show her. His voice was careful in the way it sometimes was when he was working through a problem he had already solved. Miriam said she would be there. She wrote it in her planner in blue ink, which was the color she used for things that mattered. She did not know then what he was going to show her. But she remembered, years later, the feeling of the drive over the way the August air came through the car window and the radio played something low and inconsequential, and how the afternoon had the quality of a door standing open. The first time Miriam understood that the rules were different for her than for Celeste, she was 11 years old. The elementary school science fair. Miriam had spent 6 weeks on her project, a working model of a water filtration system built from materials she had found in the garage and the hardware store on Route 9. She had drawn the diagrams herself, in colored pencil, on poster board she had purchased with her own birthday money. The science teacher, a tall woman named Mrs. Pruitt who smelled of cedar and wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, had pulled Miriam aside the morning of judging and said quietly that she thought the project was genuinely impressive. First place. Blue ribbon. A small trophy with a microscope on top. That same afternoon, Celeste had her first speaking role in the church junior choir's spring performance. It was a 2-line solo. Both events happened on the same Saturday. Diane drove to the choir performance. Gerald went with her. Miriam's blue ribbon sat on the kitchen counter when she arrived home with her grandmother, who had taken her to the fair in their place. No one asked to see the trophy. At dinner, Celeste was asked 3 times how her solo had felt. Miriam was not asked about the project at all. She passed the green beans and watched her father refill his water glass. The summer Miriam turned 14, the family took a vacation to the Outer Banks. It was a beach rental 5 days, a house with a porch that looked out over saltgrass, close enough to the water that at night Miriam could hear it through the window screen. The trip had been presented as a family celebration, though the occasion was never quite specified. On the 3rd day, Diane announced that Celeste, who was 17 and had just received her driver's license, would be allowed to take the rental car to meet a group of friends at a restaurant in town. This was a privilege extended without discussion, without negotiation, and with the particular casual tone Diane used for decisions she had already made before announcing them. Miriam asked if she could come. Diane said Celeste needed the practice driving. The matter was settled. Miriam spent the evening on the porch while her parents watched a nature documentary inside. The saltgrass moved in the wind off the water. She ate a bowl of cereal for dinner because she had not wanted to go back inside and make a production of it. The autumn of her sophomore year of high school, Miriam was accepted into an advanced mathematics program at the regional university, a Saturday program for high school students that had a waiting list of over 200 names. The letter arrived on a Wednesday in October, white envelope with the university seal. She brought it to the dinner table with a feeling in her chest that was warm and careful, the way a flame is careful in wind. Diane read the letter, nodded, and said that it would mean Saturdays were complicated for a while. Gerald said that they would work it out. The program was not mentioned again at the table. 3 days later, Miriam overheard Diane on the phone with Celeste's school counselor, arranging a college visit to a school 4 hours away. The arrangements took 40 minutes. Diane used her event planning voice efficient, detailed, enthusiastic. Miriam attended the Saturday program for 2 years. She drove herself. Once she had her license, she never asked anyone to come to the award ceremony at the end of the first year because she had already learned to do the accounting in advance. The scholarship was the fourth anecdote, and the one that settled things into their permanent shape. Miriam was a junior in high school when her parents sat both girls down and explained, with the warm precision of people delivering good news, that they had been setting aside money since each girl was born. A college fund. The figure was the same for both of them, $38,000. Miriam had heard this before, on different occasions, framed differently each time but always arriving at the same number. She had built her plans around it. She had chosen her schools accordingly. She had been careful, methodical, the way her grandfather had taught her to be careful about load-bearing things. The autumn of her senior year, Celeste applied to a private college in Virginia. The tuition was nearly $60,000 a year. When the acceptance letter arrived, the house treated it as an event. There was a dinner at the restaurant with the white tablecloths, the same one Diane had rented for Celeste's 16th birthday. Toasts were made. Gerald ordered a bottle of wine he did not usually permit on weeknights. No one mentioned the fund. It was not until March of that year, when Miriam sat down with her own acceptance letter from a state university 3 hours away and began working through the numbers, that she asked her mother directly about the $38,000. She asked at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, over coffee, in the flat tone of someone asking about a utility bill. Diane set down her mug. She was wearing a pale blue cardigan. She looked at her own hands for a moment before she answered. Most of it had gone to Celeste's first year, she said. Celeste's school cost more. It was a better opportunity. There had been gaps in the tuition. It had seemed practical. Miriam's state school was affordable. There were loans. Everyone took loans. The way Diane said it, it was nearly reasonable. The words were constructed to make the thing they described feel inevitable rather than chosen. Miriam's coffee was still hot. She wrapped both hands around the mug. The kitchen window showed the backyard, the maple tree, a morning sky that was the flat white of February. She said, simply, that she understood. She did not say anything else. She did not cry at the table. She finished her coffee, rinsed the mug, and went upstairs to her room, where she sat on the edge of her bed for a long time with her hands pressed flat against her thighs. Sunday, April 14th. It was the spring of Miriam's sophomore year of college. She was home for Easter weekend 4 days that she had spent quietly, navigating the house the way she had learned to navigate it, keeping to her room in the mornings and making herself useful in the afternoons so that the visit would generate no friction. She had folded the laundry without being asked. She had weeded the front garden bed on Saturday afternoon, while Diane hosted 3 women from the church committee in the living room. The family dinner on Sunday was attended by 7 people. Miriam's parents, Celeste and her boyfriend Preston, Gerald's brother Dennis and his wife Carol, and Miriam. The table was set with the good china. The Easter ham was Diane's grandmother's recipe, slow-cooked overnight, and the house had smelled of cloves and brown sugar since morning. Midway through the meal, Celeste mentioned that she had been invited to spend the following summer in Charleston, South Carolina, with a group of friends. The cost of the rental house was $3,000 per person, split among 8. She mentioned it the way she mentioned most things, lightly, as though floating a trial balloon, watching for the response before deciding whether to press forward. Diane asked how much. Celeste said $3,000. Gerald said that sounded reasonable. Dennis said Charleston was beautiful in June if you could stand the heat. Carol laughed. It was Miriam who said, without thinking, and in a tone that was simply practical, the way she had inherited from Howard, the habit of speaking about numbers without apology, that she had not been able to register for next semester's classes yet, because her student account showed an outstanding balance she did not recognize. She had called the bursar's office. They had said there was a hold. The table went quiet, not the comfortable quiet of a meal. The wrong kind. Diane set down her fork. She looked at Miriam with the particular expression she wore when conversations became inconvenient, the one that rearranged her face into something adjacent to patience. She said that she and Gerald had discussed it, and they had been going to talk to Miriam privately, which was clearly not happening now. Gerald cleared his throat. He said that they had taken a second draw on the home equity line. There had been some expenses. Celeste's study abroad semester in Florence the previous fall had cost more than expected. There had been a car repair. The line had been used against the house. Miriam asked what that had to do with her balance at school. Diane said that Gerald had listed Miriam's student loan as a co-asset against the equity line. It was a technical thing. It was being sorted. The tone was the same one she used for deciding things before announcing them. Miriam looked at her father. He was cutting his ham with precise attention to the task. Dennis and Carol were looking at their plates. Celeste was looking at her boyfriend. Miriam set her own fork down. She said, quietly, that she would need the loan documentation when she returned to school. She said she would not be able to register until the hold was cleared. She said she hoped that could be arranged before the end of the week. Diane said, of course. The dinner resumed. The ham was very good. Dessert was a coconut cake from the bakery in town. Preston told a story about a camping trip that made Dennis laugh. Miriam ate her slice of cake and listened to the story and nodded at the right moments and felt, somewhere beneath her sternum, something settle into a place it had been heading toward for a long time. If you have ever sat at a table where the people you love treated your reasonable question as an inconvenience, if you have ever been handed the polished surface of an explanation and understood clearly that what was beneath it was something else entirely, drop a message in the comments. You do not have to say more than that. Miriam knows that feeling, and so do a great many people watching right now. Miriam returned to school on Monday morning. She had packed the night before and had left the house before her parents were awake, which was not unusual and which she had planned so that it would not seem unusual. She had said goodbye to no one. She had left a note on the kitchen counter that said only thank you for having me in her small, careful handwriting. The drive back was 3 hours. She listened to a classical music station for the first hour, then turned the radio off and drove in silence, which was how she did her best thinking. She had a number in her head. Not the $38,000 that had been spent, not the outstanding balance on her student account. A different number. One she had been turning over, slowly, since the age of 19. The Saturday she had driven to her grandfather Howard's apartment, the summer before her junior year of high school, the one she had marked in blue ink in her planner. Howard had made coffee in his percolator, which he still used despite Miriam having given him a proper coffee maker 2 Christmases prior. He had set 2 mugs on the kitchen table beside a manila folder. He had asked her how her summer was going. She had told him about the math program, about a professor there named Dr. Elaine Marsh, who had told Miriam she had the kind of brain that solved problems other people thought were permanent. Howard had listened to this with the specific quality of attention he reserved for things that confirmed what he already knew. Then, he had pushed the manila folder across the table. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a copy of the deed to 14 West Haven Drive, her family's home. The second was a letter, typed and notarized, from Howard's attorney, a woman named Patricia Gould, explaining that Howard had, 18 months prior, made a legal gift of a fractional ownership interest in the property to Miriam as a minor beneficiary in accordance with a 1987 family trust instrument. The fractional interest was 49%. The remaining 51% was held by Howard outright, having been transferred to him from Miriam's grandmother's estate 7 years earlier. The third document was a letter from Howard to Miriam, written by hand in his engineering neat script. It said, "Your grandmother always said you were the one who paid attention. I have been paying attention too. This is not a gift. It is a correction. The house came from my mother's people, and it should go to someone who will understand what it represents. When I am gone, the remaining 51% transfers to you by operation of trust. Until then, nothing can be done to the property without your knowledge and consent. I am telling you this now, because you are old enough to understand it, and because I want you to have the full picture of the field you are standing in. Miriam had read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table, while Howard drank his coffee and looked out the window at the parking lot. She had asked one question. Did her mother know? Howard had said, no. And that is the point. She had driven home that evening with the folder in the back seat and had placed it, when she arrived, inside the lining of a winter coat in the back of her closet, inside a plastic zipper bag. Over the next 13 years, she had moved it 7 times to a filing cabinet, to a safety deposit box at a bank 20 miles from her family home, to a second box at a credit union she opened for the purpose. She had done nothing with it. She had told no one. She had simply known it was there, the way you know about the foundation of a house present, structural, not requiring attention until it does. Now it required attention. She called Patricia Gould's office from her apartment on the Monday evening after Easter. Patricia Gould was still practicing, still at the same address, still reachable. They had spoken twice over the years, once when Howard died, 4 years after giving Miriam the folder, and once when Miriam had turned 25 and Patricia had sent a brief letter confirming the complete transfer of Howard's 51%. Miriam had called then to confirm receipt. Patricia had said, "You now hold the complete deed. The house is yours. I would encourage you to take no action immediately. Let things settle." Miriam had taken that advice. For 6 years. On the Monday after Easter, she called Patricia and said that she thought things had settled. Patricia said, "Tell me what happened." Miriam told her. She was precise and brief. She named the equity line, the student loan hold, the outstanding balance. She described the dinner table, the china, the coconut cake. Patricia listened without interrupting. When Miriam finished, there was a pause that lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Patricia said, "They drew against equity on a property they do not own." Miriam said, "Yes." Patricia said, "Are they current on the mortgage?" Miriam said she did not know. She had not been told there was a mortgage. She had assumed it was paid off. The house was over 40 years old, and her father had worked in banking his entire career. Patricia said she would make some inquiries. She asked Miriam to send her the documents Miriam had been given at the bursar's office. She asked whether Miriam had any intention of moving against her parents at this time. Miriam said no. She said she had no intention of displacing anyone. She simply needed her situation corrected, and she needed to understand what had been done. Patricia said, "Give me 3 weeks." Those 3 weeks were the longest of Miriam's recent memory, and they were also, in a strange way, the most peaceful. She had been carrying the weight of not knowing for years. Now she was carrying the weight of knowing, and that was a different thing, entirely heavier, yes, but balanced. She slept well. She ate regular meals. She sat in the library on Tuesday and Thursday evenings and worked on her coursework with the methodical focus that had always come easily to her when she was not using her energy for something else. There was one night, a Wednesday, 3 days before Patricia called back, when Miriam sat on the floor of her apartment at 2 in the morning with her back against the radiator and her knees drawn up. The folder was on the coffee table in front of her. Howard had been gone 10 years. She had not cried at his funeral, which her mother had remarked upon in a tone that was not quite criticism. She had not cried because she had understood, even then, that the folder was his final act of engineering, that he had calculated the loads, distributed the weight, and built something that would hold. She cried that Wednesday night. Not for long, for the right amount of time. Then she made a cup of tea and went to bed. Patricia called on a Friday morning. She had spoken with the county recorder's office, with the mortgage servicer, and with a colleague who specialized in real property fraud. Here was what she had found. Gerald and Diane Calloway had, approximately 4 years prior, refinanced the original mortgage on the property and had, in the process, signed documents asserting clear and unencumbered ownership of the full parcel at 14 West Haven Drive. They had not conducted a title search adequate to reveal the trust instrument. The equity line drawn against the property was thus secured against an asset the bank believed was fully theirs to encumber. It was not. The bank had a problem. Gerald and Diane had a larger one. Patricia said, "You have options. You have time. And you have the kind of leverage that I would not advise deploying without careful thought." Miriam said, "What would careful thought look like?" Patricia said, "It would look like a letter to your parents that gives them an opportunity to correct this privately before anyone else is involved. It would look like a demand for full remediation of your student account and loan documentation as a starting condition. And it would look like a date certain, say, 45 days after which the bank's legal department would be contacted directly with a copy of the deed and a full accounting of what was signed at the refinance closing." Miriam asked if there was a setting that would satisfy the careful thought requirement and still be witnessed. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your parents have an anniversary every year." Miriam said, "The 35th is in August." Patricia said, "I imagine they celebrate with family." Miriam said, "They always have. Dinner at the country club. It's a tradition. My Uncle Dennis usually makes a toast." Patricia said, "That would satisfy the careful thought requirement." Miriam said she would send the letter. The letter went out the following week, via certified mail, to both her parents' home address and her father's office at the bank. It was 2 pages. It was signed by Patricia Gould on behalf of Miriam Calloway, who was identified in the opening paragraph as the fee simple owner of record of the property at 14 West Haven Drive, Carver County, Ohio. It stated the facts. It made the request. It set the 45-day deadline. Neither Gerald nor Diane called Miriam in the weeks that followed. The silence was its own kind of answer. Miriam had 45 days. She knew what she was going to do with them, and she knew where this was heading. If you have ever prepared for something for a very long time, something that required patience and documentation, and the kind of steadiness that most people are never asked to maintain, you already understand something about what the next part of this story felt like. What do you think she decided to do? The comments are open. August 12th arrived the way important evenings always do, with an unremarkable afternoon that gives no indication of what the hours ahead will hold. The weather was warm, the kind of late summer evening where the heat lingers past 7 o'clock and the sky holds its color long after it should. The Carver County Club was a single-story brick building set back from Elmwood Road behind a half-circle drive and a row of old oak trees whose roots had begun in recent years to trouble the sidewalk. The main dining room seated 90. For the Calloway 35th anniversary dinner, 62 chairs had been filled. The guest list included Gerald's brother Dennis and his wife Carol, 3 couples from the church committee, colleagues from the bank, the parents of Celeste's boyfriend Preston, 2 neighbors from West Haven Drive, and assorted extended family. Celeste was at the table closest to the window, in a dress the color of sage, sitting beside Preston with her hand on his arm. Miriam had been invited. Her RSVP had said she would attend. She had arrived early, which was unusual enough that Diane had made a brief comment about it when she walked through the door. Patricia Gould was seated at a table near the back of the room, positioned by design with a clear line of sight to the main table. She was wearing a dark blazer and had her briefcase beneath her chair. She was not introduced as an attorney. She had been invited, in the language of the RSVP, as Miriam's guest. 2 of Patricia's colleagues, a paralegal named Robert and a junior associate named Kim, were seated at a separate table, with a small recording device permitted under Ohio's one-party consent law. This had been arranged carefully and legally. Patricia had been very clear about the parameters. The dinner ran its ordinary course through the first hour. Salad. A bread basket. The murmur of conversations that had been conducted many times before. Gerald moved through the room with the ease of a man who had spent his career managing how he appeared to groups of people. Diane held her wine glass at mid-stem the way she always did and spoke to the church committee wives with the practiced warmth she deployed for social occasions. Miriam ate her salad and spoke quietly to Dennis, who sat beside her, about his garden. He had started growing tomatoes. She asked which varieties. He said mostly Brandywine. She said those were good keepers. At 8:15, Gerald rose from his chair and tapped his water glass with a dessert spoon. The room settled. This was the moment the evening had been building toward the toast. The tradition, the ritual that Gerald performed every 5 years with slight variations in language but consistent structure. He thanked everyone for coming. He said 35 years felt like both a long time and no time at all. He said some things in a marriage were worth more than money, and some things in a family were worth more than anything. He looked at Diane, who looked at him with the expression she wore when she was being seen by people whose opinion she valued. He raised his glass. The room raised theirs. And then, Miriam stood up. She did not raise her voice. She did not move toward her father or take the floor from him dramatically. She simply stood, and the quality of her standing, the quietness of it. The fact that she was clearly not finished with her meal caused the people nearest her to notice, and noticing rippled outward the way sounds carry across still water. She said, "I would like to add something, if that is all right." Gerald's glass was still raised. He looked at her across the table with an expression that crossed from surprise to something more watchful. She said, 35 years is a long time. And I think this occasion calls for honesty about what has been built. She reached into the folder she had placed beside her dinner plate. Patricia had suggested the folder be visible from the moment she sat down. It had been there all evening. Several people had glanced at it and decided it was nothing. She set 4 documents on the table in front of her without urgency. She said, 4 years ago, my parents refinanced the mortgage on the family home at West Haven Drive. When they did, they signed documents certifying that they held clear and unencumbered ownership of the full property. Those documents were not accurate. I have held a 49% interest in that property since I was 19 years old, by operation of a family trust instrument executed by my grandfather Howard Breen. I became the full fee simple owner of record 6 years ago when Howard's remaining interest transferred to me by trust succession. That transfer is recorded at the Carver County Recorder's Office. The room was very quiet. Dennis had set his fork down. One of the bank colleagues, a man named Fletcher, whom Miriam recognized from her father's work events, had his wine glass halfway to his mouth and had not moved it. Gerald's raised hand had come down. Miriam said, "I sent my parents a certified letter 43 days ago, explaining this and requesting 2 things. First, that the outstanding hold on my student account, which was placed as part of a secondary equity draw against property that was not theirs to encumber, be cleared immediately. Second, that the documentation related to my original student loans, which were co-designated as assets in the refinance process, without my knowledge or consent, be surrendered to me. I requested a response within 45 days." She looked at her father. Her voice was even. Her hands were still. She said, "I have not received a response." Patricia Gould rose from her table at the back of the room, walked forward with her briefcase, and set 2 additional documents on the table beside Miriam's. They were copies of the certified mail receipts, signed, dated, time-stamped for both the home address and the bank office. They had been signed for by Gerald's assistant. The delivery date was visible in large type. Diane's wine glass was on the table. She had not picked it up again. One of the church committee wives, a woman in a yellow blouse who had known Diane for 16 years, was looking at her with the particular expression of someone encountering, for the first time, an explanation for a discomfort they have carried for a long time without being able to name it. Miriam said, "I am not asking for anything tonight that was not already in my letter. I have an attorney present. I am willing to discuss a resolution that allows the property matter to be corrected without involving the mortgage servicer's legal department. That offer has a timeline. It remains open for the next 48 hours. She collected her documents, placed them back inside the folder with care, and set the folder on the table. She said, "Happy anniversary." And she sat down. The silence lasted perhaps 6 seconds. It felt much longer. Then Dennis cleared his throat and picked up his fork, which was the action of a man who needed to do something with his hands. Carol placed her hand on top of his. Fletcher set his wine glass down without drinking. Preston looked at Celeste. Celeste was looking at the centerpiece, which was a low arrangement of white dahlias in a glass bowl. Diane turned to Gerald and said something, quietly, that Miriam could not hear and did not attempt to hear. Gerald did not respond. He was looking at the tablecloth. His face had the appearance of a man going through a long private calculation. Dennis leaned toward Miriam and said, in a low voice, that he had always liked Howard very much. Miriam said, "He was the best of us." The dinner wound down in the way that evenings wind down when the event they organized themselves around has already occurred, though no one will say so. People found reasons to leave. There were brief embraces at the door that carried the slightly formal quality of departures from funerals. The bank colleagues shook Gerald's hand with a warmth that had measurably cooled. Fletcher did not shake his hand at all, which Miriam noticed, and which several other people noticed too. Patricia Gould walked to the parking lot beside Miriam. She said, "You did well." Miriam said, "My grandfather would have appreciated the documentation." Patricia said, "He specified the deed structure specifically for this kind of situation. He was very thorough." Miriam said, "He was an engineer." They reached the parking lot. The summer evening was still warm. In the distance, a dog was barking at something in the dark. The 48 hours elapsed without contact. On the 49th hour, Patricia Gould sent the mortgage servicer's legal department a certified letter, accompanied by a full copy of the deed, the trust instrument, the county recorder's filing stamp, and a chronological accounting of the refinance closing documents in which the property had been misrepresented. She included the certified mail receipts, demonstrating that Miriam had provided prior notice. She included the dates of the equity line draws. The mortgage servicer's legal department is not, by temperament, a patient institution. Gerald Calloway received a call from his own bank's compliance officer within 11 business days of the letter's delivery. The call concerned the refinance documentation. It concerned the equity line. It concerned Gerald's professional obligation as a licensed lending officer to understand the properties against which he had advised clients and himself to draw credit. It was noted that Gerald had signed the refinance application as both borrower and as the bank employee who had reviewed the borrower's documentation. These were not separate concerns. Gerald took an unpaid leave of absence from Carver County Savings and Loan in October. His leave was described internally as health-related. He returned in January of the following year to a position with altered responsibilities, no longer involving loan origination or application review. The bank did not announce this. Banks rarely do. The information moved through the small professional community of the county with the quiet reliability of water finding its level. The equity line was called by the servicer following the title Dispute Resolution. Gerald and Diane's attorney, a man who had handled their estate planning for a decade, navigated the correction over a period of 5 months. The property was formally redeeded to Miriam in full. A settlement was reached, the terms of which included, among other remedies, the full clearance of the hold on Miriam's student account and the surrender of all loan documentation in which her financial instruments had been listed as co-assets. The settlement also required a financial accounting of the original college fund disbursements, which confirmed, in writing, the amounts that had been redirected to Celeste's Virginia tuition and study abroad fees. Miriam did not read the settlement documents at night or on weekends. She read them on a Tuesday afternoon at Patricia's office, at the round table by the window, with a cup of coffee that Patricia's assistant brought in without being asked. The church committee learned, in the autumn following the anniversary dinner, that Diane would not be returning as chair of the annual auction. The announcement was made by Diane herself, in language that attributed the decision to a desire to step back and focus on family. The women who had known her for 16 years received this announcement with the particular politeness of people who have already formed an opinion. 2 of them, the one in the yellow blouse and a second one named Barbara, began, that winter, to call Miriam occasionally. They had always thought she seemed like a remarkable young woman, they said. They had always sensed that things were complicated. Celeste called Miriam in November. The call lasted 22 minutes. Miriam listened. Celeste said a great number of things, some of which were conciliatory and some of which were not, in the proportions that are typical of people who have benefited from an unjust arrangement for long enough that they have ceased to see it as unjust. Miriam did not argue. She said she hoped Celeste was well. She said she was always reachable if there was something specific Celeste wanted to discuss. She did not call back. Preston ended his relationship with Celeste in the spring of the following year, for reasons unrelated to the Calloway situation, though timing is a thing people notice. Gerald did not contact Miriam directly. There was a Christmas card in December with his handwriting inside a few lines, nothing that constituted an acknowledgement of anything specific. Miriam read it once, set it on the kitchen table, and did not display it on the mantel with the others. Diane sent a voicemail in February. It was 3 minutes and 40 seconds long. Miriam listened to it once. She did not return it. The house at 14 West Haven Drive stood where it had always stood, beneath the maple tree Howard had planted. The deed now said what it had always been intended to say. The following Thanksgiving, Miriam hosted dinner at her apartment for the first time. It was not a large apartment, 2 bedrooms. A kitchen with windows that faced east, a living room with mismatched furniture that she had accumulated over the years without trying to make it match, which had the effect of making it feel habited and particular rather than curated. She had a sofa the color of old mustard that she had found at a second-hand store 6 years ago and had never replaced, because it was exactly the right height for reading. She had a kitchen table that seated 5 if people did not mind being close. There were 5 people at the table that evening. Patricia Gould and her husband, a retired architect named George, who had never met Miriam before that day, but who spent 45 minutes after dinner telling her about a bridge Howard Breen had worked on in 1971, which George had once used as a student case study. Dennis and Carol, who had driven 4 hours and arrived with a bottle of wine and a bag of Orange Circus peanut candies that Dennis said he had found at a roadside store and had bought on an impulse, though Miriam suspected it had not been an impulse at all. And Miriam herself. She made the ham with cloves and brown sugar, the way she had learned from watching her mother make it for years. She made sweet potatoes and a green salad with pears and walnuts and a vinaigrette she had been adjusting for 3 autumns. She baked a bread that did not entirely succeed. It was a little dense on the bottom, but which Dennis said was the best bread he had eaten in months, and she suspected he was not entirely lying. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and roasted cloves, and the particular domestic warmth of an oven that has been on since morning. They ate without ceremony. George told the bridge story. Patricia talked about a pro bono case she was working on. Carol asked about Miriam's work. Miriam was by then a civil engineer, a fact that made Dennis smile the way he had been smiling at it since he learned it, with the particular satisfaction of someone who recognized a lineage. Miriam talked about a drainage project she was troubleshooting, something about load distribution in a problematic culvert, and George leaned in over his plate because it turned out to be exactly the kind of problem he had once solved and wanted to talk about. The maple tree in her parents' backyard was not at this table. The good china was not at this table. The guest book was not here, and no toasts were made because no one thought to make them, which meant no one needed to. After dinner, Dennis washed the dishes without asking, and Miriam dried, and they stood at the sink while Carol and Patricia and George moved the conversation to the living room, and the sounds came in from the kitchen door, a laugh from Carol, George saying something about cantilevers, and Dennis said, without looking up from the sink, Howard would have been very pleased. Miriam set the serving bowl on the rack. She said, I think he planned for it to turn out this way. Dennis said, he planned for a great many things. Outside, the November light had gone long since. The street was dark and quiet. From somewhere down the block, a child was laughing, that high, uncomplicated sound that has no agenda in it. Miriam put the last dish on the rack and folded her towel over the oven handle and stood for a moment in her kitchen, with her mismatched chairs and her left-of-center bread and her 5 people in the next room. It was enough. It was in fact the precise thing it was always supposed to be. If you have watched this story to its end, and if somewhere in Miriam's story you found an outline of your own, then this part is for you. Not for you as a viewer, and not as a lesson you were given without asking. Simply as one person saying to another, I see what you have been carrying. There is a specific kind of grief that belongs to people who were treated as less within the families that were supposed to see them most clearly. It is not the grief of a sudden loss. It is the grief of a slow, sustained discounting of arriving at tables and finding the seat shifted, of receiving the version of things that was left over, of explaining reasonable requests in a reasonable voice and being answered by silence or by something that wore the shape of an answer without being one. This grief does not require an anniversary dinner to resolve. It does not require a deed or an attorney, or a room full of witnesses. Miriam's story has those things, and they matter in her particular life, but they are not the point. The point is this. You are allowed to count accurately. You are allowed to look at what was given and what was taken and call the accounting by its correct name, without apologizing for your arithmetic. No one else's comfort is more important than your clarity. You are allowed to prepare. You are allowed to spend years building the quiet knowledge that you are not as powerless as the family arrangement suggested. Preparation is not revenge. Preparation is the practice of taking yourself seriously. You are allowed to let things be witnessed. The myth of the private settlement of resolving family injustice quietly, for the comfort of the people who caused it, serves only the people who caused it. Sometimes the truth wants to be in a room with other people present. That is not cruelty. That is accuracy finding its correct setting. You are allowed to build a table that does not include the people who diminished you. Chosen family is not a consolation prize. It is often the truer thing, the gathering that is earned rather than assigned, where no one is sorting you into a position and no one is keeping a private ledger at your expense. And you are allowed to receive what was always meant for you. Howard Breen planted a tree. He drew up documents. He made coffee in a percolator on a Saturday morning and pushed a folder across a table toward the granddaughter who had been paying attention. Because he had been paying attention too. He could not undo what had already been done. But he could do the engineering. He could calculate the load. He could build something that would hold. The people who see you as you actually are, in full, without the family mythology layered over you, those people are doing Howard's kind of work. They are placing weight-bearing structures in quiet places where they can be found when they are needed. They are building for your Thanksgiving table, even when you cannot yet see it. If this story reached you tonight, leave a comment below and tell Miriam where you are. She reads every one.